Tomorrow, I will be 60 years old. I know I don't look a day over 59. Just like that, I have lived 60 years on this earth. I have physically lived in 6 different states, 14 different cities or towns, and 22 different homes. When I think of my life in terms of how often I have moved, it makes more sense to me about why I don't feel deep connections to a particular land. I don't know where home is for me, and that has resulted in a kind of detachment from physical places. Most of my life, I have felt like a visitor in the places I live because early on, I learned that I would not be staying long. There are other things that have contributed to my lack of relationship with the more than human world. Last week, we talked about the stories we have inherited and how we have to live into our authentic stories. Our faith stories are part of the origin stories we've inherited, and we're asking, how do we live into faith stories that are authentic for us? Last week, we talked about 2 aspects of our Christian origin story that are problematic. One was the idea that we are completely broken and sinful as humans, and the other one is the idea that humans are the only ones created in the image of God and therefore superior in every way and portrayed as the pinnacle of creation. What I want to explore today is how we get from disconnection, exploitation, superiority, and loneliness to relationship. How can we develop deep relationship with the more than human world? In late March, I was with Jeanette, my partner in North Carolina, just outside of Hendersonville, to participate in a week-long forest bathing retreat that Jeanette led. I want to tell a couple of stories, and I'm not going to use names because I haven't asked permission to tell these stories, and I'm going to add some details so that the stories are a little unrecognizable. One of the stories I heard from our week together was from a person who had not done forest bathing previously and was learning how to be present in and with the forest. She didn't consider herself a tree person, though she's always enjoyed looking at them. Each morning for 5 days, we spent 3 hours outside, immersed in the natural world around us. Toward the end of the week, she surprised herself by wanting to get close to a tree. By close, I mean she wanted to go right up to it, put her arms around it, and lean her head against it. She hadn't done that before, and after being invited to hear what the trees might have to say to her, she felt invited to get close. As she laid her head against the bark, she was stunned. She could actually hear running water inside of the tree. She had never heard water moving inside of a tree before, and she would have missed it if she hadn't been listening for what the tree was trying to tell her. Someone explained that the water runs from the roots to the branches and then out to the leaves, and the reason she could probably hear it is that the temperatures had been below freezing and were beginning to warm up slowly, and there was a thaw. How many times have I stopped long enough and been willing to use our senses enough to hear a tree? I've heard them creak before, but I have never heard water running through a tree before. The next story is a story of grief and healing. More than one participant came to the retreat after having lost a spouse to illness or sudden death. Their grief was palpable. They knew nothing about forest bathing, but wondered if being in a community of people doing forest bathing might be healing. When grief is so acute, It can be hard to spend time in silence, and much of what we did in forest bathing was spend time in silence. As a person who easily senses other people's pain, I could feel their despair and sadness at times. At the end of the week, a couple of the people who came with their raw grief shared that the forest had helped to heal them. One of them told a story about having been in silence so much that they finally got in touch with their anger. They were angry with their spouse for having died way too soon and way too suddenly. The person described sensing one morning the need to walk away from the group and down into a grove of trees some distance away. They sensed the trees were ready to hear what the person wanted to say, and it was a mixture of yelling and crying. The trees held this person in some way, and by the time the person walked back up to the group, some deep healing had happened. The person expressed deep gratitude for the acceptance and the compassion the trees had offered. Why have we thought about trees objectively and abstractly when we hear stories like this? We know there are some changes we need to make to our stories in order to be ready for relationship with the more than human world. The first change that I'm going to suggest is that we give up any theology that says our bodies are bad and need to be controlled, or that the only way we can experience the divine or sacred is through our minds or our hearts. We must fully inhabit and love and honor our bodies as primary to all relationships. The second change I'm going to suggest is giving up theology that claims anthropocentrism or human specialness or supremacy, that says humans were the pinnacle of creation and everything else in the world is inferior to us. The third change I'm going to suggest follows on that, but is a reckoning with loneliness. If we can create more authentic stories for ourselves in each of these areas, we can begin to deepen relationships with one another, but also the more than human world, and be able to experience it all as kin. In his book, Healing Trees, A Pocket Guide to Forest Bathing, Ben Page talks about bodilessness as one of the hindrances to relationship with the more than human world. He describes this concept in this way: we are not taught to perceive of ourselves as bodies. We tend to think of ourself as our ideas, our thoughts, our opinions, our stories. Consequently, we think of our bodies as something more like vehicles or houses for our consciousness, that which we call ourself. By identifying with our thoughts and not our bodies, we ontologically reduce our bodies to something like a machine, something to be optimized, fixed, maintained, but not something to be experienced or loved. The body, however, is not a machine, nor is it something that we have. The body is the experience of ourselves as nature. But because we do not identify with it, we've become numb and bodiless. He goes on to talk about how different that is when we're born, which we've been able to see with Hazen. When we're young, our bodies are the central influences in our perception of reality and our experience of the more than natural world and people. But what starts to happen when we are still quite young is that often we're taught to ignore our bodies. Most schools teach us this because we're required to sit for long hours no matter what else our body is telling us to do. We're required to eat on a schedule, whether or not we're hungry. We're supposed to take naps at a specific time, whether we're tired or not, and go to the bathroom at a specific time, even if we don't have to go. Often in our families, we have to eat when it's time for a meal. Not only are we taught to ignore our body and our bodily self-care, we're also taught that our minds are far more important. Ben Page argues that by the time we're adults, we don't remember how to pay attention to our bodies anymore. And we therefore lose our sensory experience of the more than human world, among many other relationships. We lose so much wisdom that is in our bodies when we are disconnected from them. The good news is that as soon as we reject the notion of separation from ourselves and others and all living things, we've taken the first step toward relationship. When we choose to fully inhabit our bodies, our senses become enlivened and we begin to perceive our interconnections. In addition to what Ben Page is describing for what happens from our childhood to adulthood, we also have to reckon with traditional Christian stories and theology and what they've done to increase our separation from our bodies. We touched last week on the creation stories and how in the second creation story, the humans eat from the wrong tree and are punished severely by being banished from God and the garden. Though we all know these stories are myths, we cannot underestimate the impact this particular story has had on our bodies and many bodies across the ages. With Augustine's concept of original sin, our bodies were where all of sin resided forever. Because of that, we had to control, ignore, tame, disconnect our minds from our bodies, and everyone else's bodies, as a matter of fact. There is a direct correlation between Christian traditional theology and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Ever since that second creation story, it was thought wise to control women's bodies, seeing as how the woman gave the apple to the man, according to that particular story. Many of you were brought up in conservative churches like I was, and in those churches we were taught that our bodies are not spiritual, and that being sexual was not spiritual, and that we had to get our thoughts under control so we could then get our bodies under control. We were taught that sex outside of marriage was bad, and some were even taught that sex outside of the act of procreating was bad. Way too much pleasure for a body that was supposed to just bear children. Our inherited Christian story has led to the bodilessness that Ben Page describes. So what is a more authentic story for you these days? How are we going to inhabit a story in the future that says our bodies are a beautiful gift and full of senses that make us alive as long as we keep living? One of the powerful aspects of creation spirituality is the honoring of our bodies and our senses. Sensing bodies, or what many of us know as embodiment, are the medium through which nature relates to us. Robin Wall Kimmerer gave a lecture on reciprocal healing, and in it she casually mentions that monotheistic religions, including Christianity, chased divinity from the earth up into the sky where we thought we would follow to our true home, and in that upward gaze of our humanity, we lost sight of our kinfolks on earth, our mutual responsibilities, our earthly gifts. We abandoned the notion of all my relations for a hierarchy of being in which humans are perched squarely at the pinnacle, just below the angels, with our sustainers beneath us, not there as family, but as servants, or even as property. In this experiment with human exceptionalism, we tested what would happen if we thought of ourselves as masters of the universe instead of younger siblings. The results of that experiment are in. The origin stories in Genesis 1-3 are stories that have encouraged Christian people, including some of us, to further our bodilessness by focusing on our future home in heaven. Instead of leading to relationship, it has done the opposite. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer says, "Look at the legacy of poor Eve's exile from Eden. The land shows the bruises of an abusive relationship. In the Western tradition, there is a recognized hierarchy of beings, with, of course, the human being on top, the pinnacle of evolution, the darling of creation, and the plants at the bottom. But in native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the way they live. They teach us by example." Ben Page takes this a step further and says, "The culture of anthropocentrism extends bodilessness beyond humans. It projects our bias about the value and dignity of our own bodies onto the body of the earth and the bodies of other beings. We don't perceive of the earth as a living body. We ignore it or we view it as a project or something to be optimized. Nature can teach us to see with new eyes. It can revitalize our relationships. When we release ourselves from the illusion of anthropocentrism, we become able to genuinely care for the land because we sense that it is alive and it can suffer just like us. It is from this depth of relationship and shift in perception that true compassion is exercised." The question for us then is, how can we come to understand our own Christian origin story differently if we have tended toward human supremacy and bodilessness? Even though I joke about it, most of us are not going to just rip those pages out of the Bible and toss them aside. In fact, they are already so deep within us. What if we came to understand them as a cautionary tale rather than as truth? They were never meant to be truth in the first place. They were told as myths, but they have been adopted as truth. Because of the advances in science and research, we know that our bodies are made up of nature. Things like soil and stardust, and as I said last week, slugs and bananas and whales. We also know that humans were late on the scene as evolution was occurring, which doesn't equal supremacy. Though we have certain cognitive and emotional abilities, we know now that animals do too. Elephants travel hundreds of miles to go to one of their own who is dying or dead. They grieve deeply. They communicate across miles. Trees care for each other and have whole networks of communication and nourishment. Part of the difficulty we run into as Christian people is the concept of monotheism, that there is one God and that one God is supreme. Maybe because of the culture of individualism that we've been immersed in, we isolate our one God and claim all truth has to come from that one God to us directly And in that exclusive relationship between me and my God, we forget the bigger picture. As Kimmerer said, we have isolated God to existing only in heaven. What if we saw the world around us and nature and the earth as also divine, as consisting of truth and wisdom and compassion, of also being God-bearers? We are in desperate need of seeking out a variety of origin stories and hearing the authenticity in each. The story of Sky Woman falling holds a deep truth for me, and that truth is the co-creation it presents. I don't believe in a God who somehow just created every living thing on God's own. Instead, I've always thought of creation as co-creation and have searched for how that story could be told. The Sky Woman story tells a story of co-creation across species. What other stories are there? In what we are now calling a post-pandemic world, experts from a variety of fields are writing about and studying loneliness. As humans, we are apparently more lonely than ever, despite an internet that connects us with people all over the world. Or maybe because of that internet, as some might claim. On top of what we understand to be loneliness in our relationships with other humans, there is also now what is known as species loneliness. One aspect of what contributes to our loneliness in general is something that connects back to our bodilessness. We have become content with living in abstraction. Ben Page writes, "We unconsciously favor abstraction over direct experience for two reasons. First, because it's quicker and seems more efficient. And second, because it allows us to sidestep our own vulnerability. Abstraction appears more efficient because it allows us to assume that we already know something. When we rely on abstraction, we don't have to exercise any genuine curiosity. We don't have to spend time performing our own investigation. While we sometimes take the abstraction shortcut with people, we almost always take it with nature. Here are two examples. You have a friend who has a friend coming to visit. Your friend describes the person coming to visit to you. After hearing their description, you assume you now know that person, and you don't even think about the fact that you only know them in abstraction. You've had no experience of them. If you get to finally meet them, you say, "I feel like I already know you because our friend has talked about you so much." Another example, we see a tree. We don't know what the tree is, so we open our tree app and it gives us the name of the tree and its characteristics. We read about it, and then we keep walking. Our knowledge of the tree has nothing to do with our experience of the tree, but with abstraction. When we don't use our senses with other humans and the more than human world, we miss out on an experience of them. Hi, Hazen. He's giving me a little experience right here. We miss out on the experience of them, which leads to deeper knowing and deeper relationship. As long as we live in abstraction, our relationships will be superficial or non-existent, which adds to our loneliness. Robin Wall Kimmerer describes species loneliness in this way: a deep, unnamed sadness stemming from estrangement from the rest of creation, from the loss of relationship. As our human dominance has grown, we have become more isolated, more lonely, when we can no longer call out to our neighbors. Kimmerer talks about how some of the wisest native elders look at the toll on the land and say, the problem with these new people is that they don't have both feet on the shore. One is still on the boat. They don't seem to know whether they are staying or not. And let's add, for Christians, that's even more, since we're so focused on heaven. She asks the question, can Americans, as a nation of immigrants, learn to live here as if we were staying, with both feet on the shore? We understand in the business world that those who are at the top of companies or organizations are often lonely because they cannot become friends with those around them or even with their competitors, lest they begin sharing secrets or, God forbid, helping each other. We say, it's lonely at the top. The same dynamic is true if we hold to human supremacy or specialness. Everything else becomes abstract and objectified. But we are also faced with a lack of relationship to place. That's what I was talking about when I began this morning. When we live in a mobile society, which we do, especially now, we lose connection with people and place. We develop a temporary mindset which does not allow for deepened relationships unless we work hard at it. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in her lecture on reciprocity, says there is an antidote to species loneliness. She says kinship is a part of the antidote. Last week we heard that Ayo Yetunde talks about kinship as adopting each other so we become family to each other. Kimmerer suggests that we can think about what we do with humans when we know someone is lonely. What do? We might visit them, make and take them soup. We might share a joke. We might ask them what they love and then ask them where it hurts. She suggests we can do this with the more than human world. We can visit. We can sit with in silence. We can tell stories or even listen for stories. The more than human world might have some stories for us. We're going to practice some of the medicine for species loneliness as we engage in forest bathing this afternoon. While there's so much to be concerned about, there is also so much hope because everything can change, including us. The first time I traveled to Europe when I was in college, I expected to see how far superior the U.S. was in everything, because that's what I had been taught. Remember the first time you traveled and you went with that mindset thinking everything was going to just be so much worse? What I experienced was very different. The American exceptionalism I had been taught was a lie. There was so much happening in other countries that was more advanced or more practical or even more exciting than in the U.S. All I had to do was open myself to what I was experiencing, and I learned quickly how much I and we have to learn from other people, other countries, other cultures, other continents. The same is true for the more than human world. Our loneliness, our bodilessness, our addiction to abstraction, our sense of superiority, all have antidotes, or what Native people call medicine. With effort, we can heal not only ourselves, but our earth and all that lives within it. Not in a fixing kind of way, but in a relationship kind of way. As I turn 60, like many of you, I'm beginning to think about the legacy I will leave for my descendants, for the earth, and for the more than human world. What will that legacy be? I want to become childlike again and learn to pay attention to my body, to my senses, to experience, to relationships. I want my every step to feel like a thanksgiving for the earth and for all that is. Amen.